U.S. President Joe Biden is near Phoenix, Arizona, where he just delivered a formal apology that many Native Americans have been waiting decades to hear. He said he is sorry for the federal government's role in running boarding schools that sought to assimilate thousands of Indigenous children. There, they faced abuse and neglect, in addition to losing their sense of identity. Here's some of what Biden said this afternoon at the Gila River Indian community.
In 150 years, from the early 1800s to 1970, one of the most horrific chapters in American history. We should be ashamed. Generations of Native children stolen, taken away to places they didn't know, with people they never met, who spoke a language they had never heard. Children abused, emotionally, physically, and sexually abused, forced into hard labor. Some put up for adoption without the consent of their birth parents. Some left for dead in unmarked graves. And for those who did return home, they were wounded in body and in spirit. I formally apologize as President of the United States of America for what we did. I formally apologize.
For more on Biden's apology and the broader implications of him making it now, we reached reporter Benji Heyer in Washington.
Well, ultimately, this is about the president fulfilling a promise he made to tribal leaders years ago, vowing to go in person to their indigenous lands and to make this apology. He used the trip and the speech that we just heard to tout some of his investments, initiatives in the community, appointing, for example, a Native American into his cabinet, but also to address historic wrongs, becoming, as you say, the first president to formally apologize for what the White House calls Indian boarding schools, a federal policy that ran for 150 years, all the way up until 1969. President Biden just now calling it one of the most horrific chapters in American history that caused trauma and shame to be passed down through generations. It forcefully separated thousands of children from their community, from their parents, with the purpose of assimilating them, depriving them of their cultural identity, names, language, clothing erased, sometimes exposing them to abuse. And hundreds of children died in these schools, according to a review that had been conducted under the Biden administration. Now, the president says that he doesn't know if an apology can make up for the federal government's wrongs, but this is about moving forward into the light. Still, the US, many years behind Canada with this, is something that former Prime Minister Stephen Harper acknowledged way back in 2008. He apologized for Canada's similar residential schools system, but we're told that this is a move that Joe Biden has wanted to make for a long time. It's part of the president's legacy, his White House press secretary told reporters earlier, and she said this apology is historic and impactful.
And Benji, what about the timing of this apology? Coming less than 2 weeks, 11 days before the U.S. election, what's being made of that?
Yeah, it's difficult to ignore that context, really. This visit, this apology is as much about the future as the past, because it comes just 2 weeks out from the US election. Biden isn't running for the Oval Office, of course, but the Gila River Reservation partly sits within the boundaries of a county in Arizona that could well decide the 2024 presidential contest. Maricopa County, razor tight last time, and as election day draws closer, Democrats are hoping that these communities in these key swing states will help secure the White House for Vice President Kamala Harris. She has won the endorsement from the leaders of at least 17 of the 22 federally recognized tribes, including the Gila River community where Joe Biden is today. And she's held events earlier this month on Gila River land, again in an effort to try to persuade voters. Former President Donald Trump also visiting Arizona this week, though he hasn't visited indigenous communities specifically.
Benji Heyer reporting from Washington. For more on this, we're joined by Brian Bull. He's an assistant professor of journalism at the University of Oregon and a member of the Nez Percé tribe. And thank you for taking the time. Appreciate this very much. First, I'd like to start just with your reaction to President Biden's apology.
Thank you for having me on, Andrew. Yeah, I listened to that and I was just riveted that I was hearing the President of the United States acknowledging all forms of abuse directed at thousands of Native school kids who had been taken away from their families. He was unflinching in his apology. I think this was something that a lot of Native communities, especially those with survivors and victims in their communities, have long wanted to hear. And I feel that the president delivered on those remarks.
Now, Indigenous people have been suffering from government policies for decades. What do you think? It's hard to ignore the context, right? What do you think this says about the timing, 11 days before Election Day, but also after years of research and evidence into school abuses?
I've been covering this story, this issue, for a number of years, Andrew. Way back when I was working in South Dakota and also again in Wisconsin and more recently in Oregon. And it always seemed to fall on deaf ears. There was either reluctance on part of the federal government to acknowledge that it was part of these crimes. Also, a number of organized churches had been running these boarding schools. And it always seemed to be a matter of just leaving it to the victims to prove these cases. But what we've seen in recent years, just in the last 5 years, really, is the discovery and exhumation of mass children's graves behind a number of these boarding schools in Canada and in the United States. So the evidence is you can't just ignore it anymore, that this was an actual atrocity. And many of these victims died alone and far from their home communities. I'm not sure what this will play in terms of the U.S. election. Of course, President Biden is not running again. Kamala Harris is the one who is on the ticket. But there may be Native communities who have wanted the federal government to acknowledge wrongdoing and may transfer that response from the president to his vice president. We'll have to see.
What could an apology like this mean in terms of collective healing?
For one, it puts the blame on the federal government, which a lot of Native families, communities have wanted for a long time. It gets it out there. It makes it part of the official record. It has been said. It cannot be retracted. Many people who were there at the Gila River Indian Reservation today, I heard chanting, "Thank you, Joe," and breaking into long bouts of applause and cheering. So I think that it will go a ways towards helping heal some of the wounds to at least have the government acknowledge its part in this system that ran for 150 years. We're talking from 1819 to 1969. The Interior Department report says that at least 18,000 children were forcibly taken from their families, and at least 973 died while in these boarding schools. So it gets the conversation going again, I think, in a way that Native people have wanted for a long time. And I think it will build and hopefully go a ways towards restoring some confidence and trust back between the government to government relationship that tribes and the federal government want to establish.
So yeah, I was just going to ask you a little bit more about that. Do you see this as the beginning of a longer process?
We'll see. I think it depends on the next administration. There has been overtures made by both the Biden administration and, of course, the Obama administration to create annual summits where the federal government, the White House, hosts a tribal summit. Those did not continue under the Trump administration, although I do recall former President Trump saying that he would work to better the situations for tribes in certain areas. But, you know, the details are a little vague yet. I think it will go a ways to helping build a little more confidence in the federal government. But, of course, past this apology, it will depend on what the next standing president will want to do and what that outreach will be to tribes. So I think there will be an acknowledgement and appreciation of this apology, but there is also going to be some anticipation as to what will follow it.
Brian, it was good to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time. Appreciate this.
Thank you for having me on, Andrew. Take care.
That was Brian Bull of the University of Oregon and the member of the Nez Percé tribe.